Hey, welcome everybody to this Edge of Mind podcast, where I am really delighted to introduce you to a dear friend and quite an amazing individual, Scott Berman, who runs dark retreat center that I had the great luxury of attending. And after the formal, usual introduction, we're just going to jump into a host of really cool topics. So, Scott Berman is the founder of Sky Cave Retreats, the first darkness retreat center in the US. Throughout the last decade, he has spent over 2 years in self-guided solar retreats in remote wilderness. He did his first darkness retreat in 2012 and has since spent over 70 days in multiple solo darkness retreats, including a couple with his wife, Jill. Over the last 4 years, Scott has supported hundreds of people in their dark retreats and has been pioneering the darkness therapy movement in his center in Southern Oregon. So, Scott, my friend, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to hang with us. Super
Yeah,
appreciate it.
thanks for having me, Andrew.
Yeah, so gotta ask, man, how did you get into this stuff? This is
Yeah,
not exactly the normal approach to meditation or retreat. So, tell us a little bit about what brought you into this really somewhat unique, radical form of practice.
yeah. I had like a kind of a disillusionment moment, long experience in college, and kind of lost interest in achieving the things of the world, and uh, and then it turned to achieving spirituality, which has then turned into something else. But it started there, and so I started to spend a lot of time in solitude, and so then over the course of the next 10 years. Pretty much all through my 20s, I spent a lot of time in solitude, mostly in the mountains in southern Baja. There's some magical desert oasis that I discovered, and so I'd be there for 3 to 6 months every year, and then a lot of time up in the mountain in Mount Shasta. And over the course of that time up there, I really loved and delighted in the exploration of solitude and meditation. And at a certain point, somebody mentioned a darkness retreat to me. There was somebody in Northern Oregon who was doing and offering holding darkness retreats, and not in a tradition. My understanding was he was a vet and he just felt like he needed to decompress and just started going into a room just with a little red light, like a kind of a very dim red light. And then somebody mentioned to him, like, why don't you take the red light out? Like a darkness retreat is some kind as a regenerative practice. So he did that and really started to explore the benefits of darkness retreat. And so somebody mentioned that to me and it really lit me up as I just loved solitude and was really into those kind of things. So in 2012, my wife and I blacked out our house and we did our first darkness retreat together. We went in for 5 days. And from that, I was really motivated to go solo into the dark. So a few months later, I went back down to Baja. I helped finish build this earth bag dome that someone had started the year before. And then I blacked it out and I went in for 10 days. And that was in 2013. And I was completely humbled and floored by how challenging it was. I was definitely went in with a spiritual ego and a sense of like, I've got this. I've spent years alone. I can meditate 12, 14 hours a day and I love it. And so I'll be fine. And definitely got the rug pulled out from under me when I went into the dark and realized that it's a lot more than an act of meditation, being able to meditate for a long period of time. It was like a completely different way of orienting that was pretty unfamiliar to me. And but due to my sincerity for like really being in what was exposed, I wanted to continue in that. And so I wanted to build a dark retreat. Mostly I thought for myself, and I thought maybe a few other friends might be interested. And now it's been a lot more than that. And so we landed in Southern Oregon 7 years ago and started building our first dark retreat in 2018. Our first one was built out of cob, so it took a while to build, it took a while to dry, and then about 4 years ago, in the spring of 2020, we started hosting darkness retreats here.
And you've been booked like crazy solid for the last 2 years and booked out at least 2.5 years in advance. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it got pretty popular pretty quickly.
Yes. And so tell me a couple things here. Um, how have you related to some of the anxiety and fear? Obviously, you have a somewhat fearless approach to doing inner work.
Hmm.
I think Doc Retreat puts inner work on steroids, right? So has fear been and fear and anxiety been part of your journey? And if so, I'm curious how you negotiate it.
Yeah, that's a great question. As I feel like I'm still uncovering it, like the levels of which I've built protective mechanisms on top, and where I feel like I began to see how I used my meditation practice as a way of almost like inhibiting me or like covering anxiety and fear. I probably wouldn't have said that a year ago because I wasn't aware of that. But now, as I see more of being with people in the dark and then see more of myself and the kind of the cyclical nature of just deepening into that, I see the different mechanisms more and more of what I do to cover anxiety and fear and what others do. And so there's this constant exposure of noticing anxiety and fear. And, for me, when in the past, when I've done dark retreat, I've always spent most of my time in bed. And because I always felt the most comfortable there, it felt the best. And when I'd get out of bed to like go to the bathtub or eat some food or go to the bathroom, I'd always feel a little unsettled. And then I'd do my thing and I'd go back to bed. And I never really thought much about that because it was just like the bed was my safe place. It's where I felt safe and where I spent most of my time. And then when Adrian, who maybe we'll touch on a little later, who does somatic sessions before and after people go into the dark and really orient them somatically, which is kind of the foundation of our approach here. I heard her sharing with someone about how to notice if you're going into fight, flight, or freeze, which everyone who enters into the dark feels unsettled in some way. And now, like a large percentage of those people have really advanced mechanisms, managing mechanisms, coping strategies, installative patterns, whatever it is, to like endure and to just get by and not actually really register how overwhelmed and unsettled they feel. And then there's a large percentage of people who aren't even able to avoid it or are really in their sincerity willing to be in the exposure and the honesty of what's there. And sometimes a little pointing or questioning really helps people land in that. And I could share a little kind of just case studies and explorations with individuals that really were illuminated some of that. But for myself, when I heard Adrian talking about freeze with somebody, she was the one piece that really struck me was you tend to not want to walk around the room or leave one space. You tend to feel safe in one space, but like unsettled walking around the room. And I was like, wow, that is totally me. And I never really thought of it as some kind of mechanism and some kind of like almost low grade freeze state. I ended up going into the dark. I was just intending to go into the dark a couple weeks later. And when I went in, I could see my mechanism to stay in bed because it felt most safe and comfortable. And so, because then I became aware of it, which I wasn't before, I sat myself in the middle of the room very often for hours, and my whole body would contract. Like my chest would caved in, my heart felt like it completely closed, and there was like a rock in the middle of my chest, and there was so much tension in my body just from sitting in the middle of the floor. And it was so illuminating to me to see that I had this mechanism of doing something to feel safe and avoiding really the unsettledness, but not even realizing that because it was, on some level, it was beneficial to avoid feeling unsafe. Who wants to feel unsafe or go directly into fear or march directly into disappointment? And so I just stayed in my comfort. Although I didn't realize that. I was deepening. There was so much stillness and subtlety, but there was this subtle avoidance of, or not so subtle, but it felt subtle at the time, avoidance of what was uncomfortable. And when I found myself sitting in the middle of the floor, just in the exposure of whatever that was from, the unsettledness, the discomfort, the feeling of being exposed and not enfolded in my bed, and just being with that and just being honest with where I was really at when I was truly fully exposed. So that was kind of, yeah, one of my more recent explorations in being in the anxiety and the fear that arises in the dark that I prior wasn't even aware of. But with a little bit of questioning and pointing out, I began to see one of the mechanisms that I had in there.
Yeah, that's really great. Before we go deeper, because this is such rich material, talk to us a little bit about I mean, you had some 300 plus people, 350 people come through the three caves that you
Mhm.
have there. Talk to us a little bit about what constitutes a traditional experience at Sky Cave.
Mhm.
And then after that, what are the main reasons why people go in to Dark
Mhm.
Retreat? What you're
Yeah,
discovering. But first of all, just give a sense for like what happens when somebody arrives there. What do they do? The role of Adrian's work, as you mentioned, the body work thing. That'll give people a greater sense of what actually constitutes a retreat.
totally. So somebody tends to arrive in the afternoon and they have the day to kind of settle in, maybe get acquainted on the land. Typically, people go into the dark that first night, and then they have the next 24 hours to weave in and out of the dark. And so that may look like somebody might stay in there all the way till the next day afternoon when they have their session with Adrian, which I'll touch in more about. Some people might come out in the morning, go for a walk. Um, all different ways that people weave in and out of that dark during that first 24 hours. And then so the next day, which is kind of their first full day here in the afternoon, Adrian, who's been a dear friend of mine for the last 15 years and has been here at Sky Cave for the last 2 years. She does somatically oriented sessions, preparing people for the dark for 2 hours before they go in. And then she also does it 2 hours after they come out on really on an integrative level. Those sessions really, they almost like pre-expose people to what they may encounter and confront in the dark. As yeah, Adrian has a real knack and ability for and deeply perceptive of like tracking with and feeling what is going on in someone's body and able to point and ask questions at really significant moments that then really people begin to tune in on their own to what's happening in their body, to the unconscious movements that's happening, how they cover anxiety, fear, shame, anger, sadness, all these different things that move in our body that begin, as I said, to like pre-expose people, and they're able to co-regulate and just settle in and be honest with where they're really at. And maybe that also exposes expectations and all these different things that have people maybe floating above or hovering around what's actually happening and kind of attempting to move towards what they want or what they think they want or how they think it should look like or all those different things. And so then that night, their second night here, people go fully into the dark. Typically, people go in for 3 days, 4 nights, consecutively.
And what constitutes people always ask like how are they fed? How do you deal with the kind of the basic necessities of
Yeah,
living?
right. Great question. So there's a double pass-through door. Um, there's one, like the caves, two of them are built into the hillside, and you open a door and walk down some steps, and there's a little, like a mud room, if you will. And then there's a door that goes into 250, 300 square foot dark room. And in that dark room, there's toilet, sink, there's a bathtub for hot baths, there's a place to stretch out, yoga mat, foam roller, cushion, there's a low table to eat, and then there's a bed. And then in the mud room, there's a big masonry stove that we feed from our side to heat and the caves in the cooler months, and also this light sealed double cabinet, if you will, where we have a door on our side and then there's a door on the dark side. And so we bring food, put it in there, close our door, and then on the other side, the dark retreatant opens it and gets their food.
And
And
that's once a day, right?
that's once a day. We bring all the food in the evening, and then we also come up in the morning. That tends to be the time where we light the fire so that we could warm up the cave during the day and not cook people out at night, and also provide another point of check-in for people. As we find that the check-ins, those touch points, no matter how like small they are, we may even just chat with someone. I may chat with someone for just a few minutes, but how powerful that is, how much that really, just those few moments of a compassionate witness and someone asking questions that allows someone to maybe look through another lens, to feel comfortable and safe, like being exposed. I mean, I've even heard many people say, like, I didn't realize I needed permission to feel that. Like where we live in a culture and even like a spiritual culture at times where feeling anger or anxiety or fear or sadness or any of that is not even, it's not allowed or it's looked down on. And then all the ways that people internalize that and almost kind of hover above what they're really feeling. And then when there's someone there who's just in that with them and there's almost that permission, it's amazing to see what people then allow themselves to come into, and like another level of feeling safe and settled in the body. And like, on that too, it's been, which was another topic we were going to explore, was just fear and feeling safe in the dark. That there's a level of unsettledness that naturally everyone feels who goes into the dark. And, part of that being that people lose like their location in time and place. Like how disorienting that is. All of a sudden you're floating in space without any concept of time and without any kind of reference point. And what that does just to like at a very primal level to someone's system of being at that level of exposure and vulnerability with nothing to kind of hold on to, and how unsettling that is. And then from that, most people then manage that because we're, habituated to managing overwhelm in the world, and we don't always have time to just really tune into how overwhelmed we are or how much fear there is, or nor do we sometimes even feel safe enough to do that. So witnessing how people then move forward to manage the experience, to manage their overwhelm, to manage the discomfort, and then those check-ins provide at times an opportunity to really co-regulate, to acknowledge how unsettled someone may be feeling in their body and to just really settle into that together during that check-in.
And then the last day, talk to us a little bit about what happens on the back end.
Yeah, so someone goes through that 3 days, 4 nights. They come out in the morning of that, what would be now their fifth full day here. And they have that day to integrate. And they have a session with Adrian in the afternoon, and then they leave the next day morning. And I mean, on that, just one note on that, which was in the early days, definitely a lot that I see now, and our pretty much entire approach has, I'd say, mostly been birthed out of Adrian and like her insight, her depth of seeing. And then once she points it out to me, usually I can see it, track it, and then also feel it on my own. In the early days when she first came, people would come out of the dark and then they'd have these amazing experiences as they'd come out. And I'd be like, wow, this person had such a profound experience. They're so stoked and grateful and all these things. And then she'd have the session with them and just would provide me just with a little general feedback of like that actually wasn't really the case. Um, that's not what I experienced on my end. And then when I would go up and talk with that person and they would share, they had a lot more to share on that. Adrian would leave it at that. And when I went up to check in, that person was in something completely different. And it was almost like the relief of coming out of the dark people were really joyous and happy. And the way that they were kind of holding their breath while they were in the dark, like it wasn't necessarily this nurturing experience. And this was a little bit more in our earlier days where we weren't as connected with people. There weren't really check-ins in the earlier days so much. They've kind of really evolved how we're with people. The whole offering is constantly evolving and changing. And I was not as aware as I am now of like how much people were almost hovering and managing the experience. And then when they came out, there was so much relief that it was over. And so that initial reflection back onto their experience was through this sense of relief.
Hmm.
But when they really got taken back into what was really going on in their body, there was a lot of unsettledness. And now seeing that, that's almost our like entry point and foundation of being with everyone is like, let's just go. Like, we're not trying to blast off and have a profound spiritual experience and like into the illumination, but let's actually go into what's unsettling. And then from that, there is a natural deepening into, the subtleties and the depth, but it's through that door of disappointment, anxiety, fear, unsettledness.
So does Adrienne, Scott, does Adrienne also then, it's not entirely clear to me, does she provide a little bit of advice slash counsel for people before they go in, or is it mostly just this unspoken somatic so-called assessment?
Yeah, no, there's a big talking piece. Like it is mostly or it's like a body experiential exploration. And so there is questions as people tune into their body and um and then there is um practical explorations for being in the dark, like how to notice if you're in fight, flight, or freeze,
Mhm.
how to use your body as an anchor, how to notice your expectations and when disappointments are rising, and like how to actually use that as a vehicle for like allowing yourself to be exposed and just being in what you're honestly in. So it really orients people like how to let nurture lead. There's something that Adrian invites people into that I use at times when during the check-ins is like following the impulse. Um, like how to really notice like why you're doing what you're doing, like whether you're getting up from your chair to your bed or your bed to your chair, or how you're moving through the room, why you're doing meditation or yoga or any of that, to really tune in with your body right when that impulse arises to take some kind of action, to notice like, are you moving from a contracted state and you're like trying to manage it and cover it and change it, or are you moving from a space that is connected, settled, and like there's just a movement to nurture? And then the same activities, it doesn't matter what it is, it's more like where it's arising from. And so just really beginning to attune people to that. So there's just a deeper honesty and less of a movement to achieve something.
Yeah, that's really nice. It reminds me of this little jingle, deception cannot follow you into your body. And
Mm,
so it's a basis of lie detectors and the like. And so the more you can stay in contact with your body, the more embodied you are. Because the darkness, and for those who are listening, I've done many dark retreats over the last dozen or so years, as Scott has. I've noticed that one of the biggest problems is dissociation, disembodiment. That's when things can become a little bit problematic. So it's extraordinarily, I think, insightful, practical to have people doing the sort of body work. And then when I did my retreat with you, I have to share this. I was just completely delighted in the most surprised way how much advantage I took of the beautiful little bathtub in there. I'm not a bathtub kind of guy, but I look forward to filling it up every day. It was my water meditation, hanging in there for extended periods of time, which I never give myself the luxury to do, help me in this really, truly like spiritual, sensual practice of staying connected, staying embodied, and delighting in the soma. So I think what you do there with Adrian in conjunction with bathtub is pretty darn clever.
Yeah, that tends to be a big anchor for a lot of people I mean, there's nothing like getting in a warm bath to help someone feel settled and connected and safe in their body.
Yeah, the whole thing is actually incredibly embryonic. You're going into the earth, which is feminine. You're in this almost placental environment with the liquidity of the tub. And so there's something quite powerful about the quality of femininity, and also working with the original basis of things, darkness as being origins. But let's talk a little bit about, because there's so much to say. What have you discovered in the hundreds of people that come through? Why do people do this? Because from the outside, it's like, oh, you're gonna do what? Right? It's just like so out there. So, what are you noticing with the hundreds of people that are coming through? What's a particular kind of profile of somebody going in? Why do people tend to do it?
Yeah. I think there's like it's such a wide-ranging audience. There's the percentage of people who are deep into exploring their inner landscape and spiritual growth. So they've been on retreats, they've done plant medicine, um, breath work, things like that. They're kind of have been steeped in that for years, and this is another thing in their exploration of their interior. And then there's a handful of people that just want to come rest, reset, unplug, slow down. It's not necessarily the spiritual motivation, I mean, is there, but it's not, that doesn't seem, it's more simple in them in a sense. Like there's not, um, the primary is more to like relax, slow down, a sense of more like curiosity being kind of more the foundation. Um, and then, I mean, we have a percentage of people who come here who have little to no spiritual background and who have never done plant medicine. And like they watch some videos of people come out of the dark and they're just like, I want that. That like really spoke to me. Like there's just something in the authenticity and the exposure and the vulnerability and that was really real. And like, I want that. People who come who just are like, I want to be a better husband, father, dad, like just want to better themselves and see this as a method of really exploring and leaning into that. So it's kind of a from just general curiosity to people who are deep on a spiritual path.
And are you also finding people going in for purposes of creativity, to
Hmm.
problem solve, to answer questions? Because of course, there's a lot of traffic with the celebrities that are coming in to solve these celebrated problems, so to speak. So
Yeah.
is that also part of what you're saying?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there is that. There's I mean there's people who just want to unplug from responsibility and are just curious in that, like people um who have loads of responsibility, high level entrepreneurs to sports figures, to musicians who come more for like a creative exploration in the dark. It's been such a wide range of people coming for like different reasons. I mean, at the core, the common shared is the darkness. So is the simplicity, is the quietude, is the slowness, and just removing oneself from kind of the daily grind and the kind of stepping into the unknown.
Yeah,
Yeah.
be curious. And how about contraindications? I suspect this is not for everybody. Are there people in your application process, and what might actually constitute, if you could say briefly, what constitutes the application so-called screening process? And are there people that you would say, this may not be the best for you, either overt contraindications or more intuitive contraindications for people who
Yeah.
shouldn't do this?
So people with mental health issues um, would certainly would be a contraindication and would be maybe somebody who would weave in and out of the dark, but not somebody who would really feel comfortable taking on for like a longer darkness retreat. Um, and I think that's one thing is we tend to keep it. Well, maybe I won't jump there yet, but to talk about the length of time in the dark could be an interesting, yeah, topic of like why we keep it at 3 days. 4 nights typically now. But into just on the contraindications, um, diabetes is another one. We have had a couple people come with diabetes, and one of those people did turn on the light a couple times a day to check his levels. And we worked closely with him with food. So it was something that we did make work and worked through with him. And outside of like maybe somebody who's on antidepressants and different kind of medications, like those things would be a contraindicative. And outside of that, we've tended to really be able to take that wide-ranging audience from people with PTSD and different kinds of trauma. And we end up, because we have such an intimate connection with people while they're here, it's not just like people arrive, we put them in the dark, and then we come back 4 days later. Then we would have a lot more strict of a screening process because now people are alone. We don't really know what's going on. But as we receive people, when they even arrive and they go through that initial session with Adrian, sometimes we customize people's retreats like right from there, right from when they arrive. So there is almost a sense of like, because they're not coming and just going right in, it is this like really, we don't have a playbook of like what's said on day one and day two. When you go up to check in, you say this. It's really meeting people where they're at, being in what's exposed with people and like really settling into that. So there is a customization where someone might come and it might feel like from where they're at, which, we might have not been able to ask the right questions or get the information before they arrive, but when they're here, it's clear of like maybe weaving in and out of the dark may be best. Why don't you spend the first 2 days coming out a little bit and then go back in, and maybe you spend a whole day in there consecutively in the middle, or maybe turn the light on a little bit, that there is more of a customization once somebody's here and clear. Um, yeah, because there's so many questions we could ask, and everyone's always going to answer honestly to the degree that they're aware of and able to be honest. And we've seen people who would maybe find themselves to be like scared of the dark and maybe a little timid and make themselves small and would maybe consider themselves like very sensitive. And so with that person prior, we may have been a little concerned, somebody who's scared of the dark and overly sensitive. But then there's somebody else who's just like, I've got this, I'm so strong, I can do anything and all these things. And then that person who is overly sensitive and scared of the dark just like opens and settles, and like, I'm that person who can do anything comes completely undone, because they're overwhelmed and not able to really be in it. So it's interesting to witness, um, that it's for some people they can manage the overwhelm in there, and some people genuinely are honest in the exposure of the overwhelm and settle into something profoundly new.
So is it safe to say, therefore, what I'm hearing is we have to thank Mick Jagger for this one. You may not always get what you want, but the doctors may give you exactly what you need. Have you find that cliche to be actually quite applicable in the dark?
Yeah, I'd say about 100% of the people who come here are like, that was not what I thought. It was not what I expected, and that was way harder than I could have ever imagined.
Yeah,
And that the people who really drop into something, not to give it a gauge, like profoundly new,
yeah.
are just like, I never could have even imagined that. It's a completely different way of orienting. Like all of a sudden, it's like, as opposed to looking towards to our experience for a gauge of worth and meaning and purpose, it's like we begin to look to the quality of our relationship, the quality of our welcoming, the quality of how we receive, the quality of how we are with what's happening, as opposed to looking to what's happening. And then so when people really get that reorientation, which is completely different, because now it's like you're at a loss for how to gauge if you're doing it good and if you're doing it right and if you're worthy and do you even have a purpose? And it's like all the answers is no, you don't. And it's just like you're just in the quality of your inclusion, of your honesty with what's here. And one of the hang-ups for just about everybody, and some people are just so directly honest too, of like, I don't know if I'm doing this right. And it's like, and that's an amazing entry point into exploring the expectation of what does it look like. So then my next question is, well, what would it look like if you're doing it right? What would be happening in you if you knew you were doing it right? And it's usually like, well, I'm having a great experience. Something great's happening to me, you know? And then so that's this great entryway into like, but that's not what's happening right now. And so what would it look like if you were just genuinely with the disappointment or whatever may be happening right now?
Yeah, that's really beautiful. So this begs the question that you're starting to hit at, which is like, what are you doing there, right? You've got all this time, and it's like your usual distractive mechanisms are completely frustrated. And so, what do you do in there? You're suggesting a couple things, but let's throw a dart at this a little bit more specifically.
Yeah, what are you doing there? Um, well, one of the explorations is not doing. Like what happens when you release doing. And for those who are maybe more spiritually oriented or have practices and techniques and breath work and all that, is like one of the things we really explore is that trap that Chogyam Trungpa so brilliantly illuminates in his work, is the achieving of spirituality, and like how that then is like there's this idea for everyone and it's different of like what it looks like when we've arrived, when we've made it, what enlightenment looks like or whatever it is, and then how we use that as a gauge of our worth, of meaning, of purpose, of self-importance on some level. And so that exploration of like what happens when we let go of doing, achieving, and accomplishing even spirituality. And then so like what we're left with is being with, opening, welcoming, receiving what's actually here. So that's where with the sessions with Adrian and the check-ins during the morning and evening, where there is this kind of orienting to the body, of like using the body as an anchor. Like, what are you feeling in your body? Where are you feeling it? What's it like if you were to like really welcome and like bring it in more, like lean in closer in a real intimate relating with it, and not for any gain, not because you're going to get something or somehow it's going to break through to something grand, but because it's honesty that matters most. And that tends to be a question that I lead with when people arrive, when they're in there, is like, what matters most to you? What's most important? And that tends to be then for me a way in with the people who, an entry point with the people who are here. And also for me, a way to honor and meet them where they're at of what is most important. And then we really explore distilling that down of like, why is that most important? What happens when you're in that? What happens in your body when you're connected to that? And distilling down what's most important. And then the question is, if you were honest with what's most important, what would you be doing right now? Like, what would be happening for you? And usually no one's like, well, I'm having a peak experience and it's amazing. It's usually distilled down to something very, very, very simple and not very grand. And then people can be in that conflict and in the exposure of like, I'm clear that this is what's most important, but for some reason, I'm holding this as more important because it's certainly going to make me feel a lot better about myself. And so then we really walk that line and explore that conflict.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. It's like this maxim, expectation is premeditated disappointment, right? So if you go in there with your spiritual aspirations and looking for the 4th of July, the darkness might teach you otherwise, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And I think like and there's so many levels of a lot of people like I don't have expectations. And it's like, well, they might you might not have a clear expectation, but like certainly you're coming here for some kind of reason, and part of it may be rest, but like and that unfolds in there. And so and somehow it becomes it can almost be cloaked in so much like real goodness of somebody who's just I just want to do it right. And not even seeing that as an expectation, like they're expecting to do it right, but that gets written off as an expectation because it's through this lens of like so much goodness. Like for example, when sometimes we begin to unpack like what's most important and people are like, well, doing good in the world. There's one person who came and he was like, well, doing good. And then so I was like, well, let's distill that down further. Like what happens when you're good? And it's like, well, I'm noticed as being good. And then he could see in that moment that although as righteous and beautiful as it was in him to do good, there was a move part of that movement in him was to be seen as doing good and be validated as being good. And he could see then that there was this movement to there was an unsettledness, like underneath that was an uncertainty and an unsettledness. And then there was one other person, a different person, but as we really unpack that, he was like, I'm noticing that I want to have a certain kind of experience where like you think I'm good and you see me as worthy and important. And us really going into that and just the beautiful things that come from that as we really get underneath, well, like if that's what you're wanting, then underneath that is likely a feeling of lack, of unsettledness. And what happens when we can just be in that and really honest with that? And then from there, for a lot of people who were genuinely able to meet that in themselves, they begin to settle into such a profoundly embodied awareness of stillness, and the resistance is gone, so there's not much of a movement. Their mind quiets because a lot of the activity was from trying to get something that they don't have. And there's been so many people who have not much meditation history or background who drop into stillness for hours. And it's amazing to witness it too, because these people they're not like, look at I did or I got it. They're usually in awe and surprised. They're like, I don't know what's happening. I'm not having any thoughts. I'm just rested and still. I feel really connected and nothing's happening in my mind and I have no idea why. And it's just amazing, just that honesty and that exposure. And then a lot of the activity just settles on its own without somebody managing the experience or even directing their focus.
Yeah, that's excellent. So I just want to make sure, for points of clarification, it seems like a really delicate, wonderful dance between people finding their own way, this kind of emergent design, emergent customization that you and the retreat kind of co-design.
Mm,
Um, so talk to us a little bit about that quality of the path is made by walking. In other words, you just see what
mm,
unfolds versus levels of suggestion, because I think that's a really delicate dance because you're in there as a seasoned practitioner, able to throw just a few very skillful points of suggestion for perhaps queries or investigation and the like. And then all in this narrative that you're pointing out of how it is, what I'm hearing is really one of the reasons you go into the dark, ironically, paradoxically, is to learn how to see. And so talk to us a little bit about that, the relationship between finding one's own way
mhm.
versus the kind of collaborative dance that takes place between you and the retreatant.
Yeah. So yeah, like you said, there's these in those points of contact, like suggested explorations or questions, these little queries that I'll ask during those check-ins that prompt people in certain ways. And then they walk it themselves, or we may walk it together during that 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes that we're there. And for some people, it's also an opportunity to co-regulate, to allow someone to get closer to the overwhelm and the unsettledness that they're maybe not even able to touch or be aware of, but while somebody else is there, they can settle into it. And so those, yeah, the walking it on their own, like there's these suggested explorations and these qualities of like what do you notice in your body right now? And then whatever it may be, and then it's like, what do you notice in your body when you bring like a quality of welcoming and receiving? And then people just describe it, and we're kind of in that. And then I leave, and they're on their own for the next 8 to 12 hours. And so, like you said, that they walk it on their own. How they take that, what they do with it. There's not, it's a pathless path in there. And one thing I think that a lot of people, or everyone in there comes to see, and I found it after my first solo dark retreat, is like maybe no matter how long you can meditate, for most people, it's like you can't necessarily, you're not meditating in a formal practice forever. So there's almost like the way through to really settling in the dark is this more, at least in our experience, this more like open, receptive, connected, intimate settling in your body. And so that's really the invitation and the exploration that we're in with people. And then ultimately where people walk that out themselves in there.
Yeah, yeah, that's just so spot on. So you again, you're hitting on some really wonderful topics that I want to just put exclamation points on. So, perhaps more specifically, profiles for successful experience. I mean, either in advance, what can people do in advance, or what would constitute a profile for someone to come in? Because what I'm hearing, and don't let me put words in your mouth, is that on one level, the beginner's mind, the childlike, I don't know mind, can really allow you to then become vulnerable and penetrated in a very skillful way by the medicine of the darkness, versus the expert's mind that comes in, the high-tech spiritual person who has all these techniques and all these sophisticated technologies, gadgets, to whatever, to work with their mind. And lo and behold, the darkness is just completely dismembering that, pulverizing that. So talk to us a little bit about the profile for a successful experience. And then
Mhm.
when we're finished with that, profiles for an unsuccessful experience. It's probably indicated, but I want to be quite specific about both of those.
Yeah. So I think first in that, which we try not to do because then it's like now we're setting a gauge, and like the beauty of the darkness is it wipes out the gauge, although we still carry that, but like our orientation too is like wipe out the gauge. But if we had to have a gauge for a successful experience, maybe we'd use the gauge of like depth of honesty,
Hmm.
maybe.
Nice.
That way we're not looking to what's happening. We're looking to the depth of our connection to what's happening, like our honesty and the exposure of what's happening. And so that takes a real sincerity, like somebody who is genuinely sincere in wanting to be honest and connected and intimate with the truth within. And that is more important than having a profound spiritual experience, having a special experience, seeing lights, um, having anything to show for yourself, even. Like the simplicity of just being honest and in what is here right now. Like that is the greatest recipe for a successful experience. And that tends to be somebody who it's more like the qualities of being as opposed to like people's experience necessarily. I mean, people's experience may have crafted the qualities of their being, but the qualities being more important than meditation experience, breathwork experience, plant medicine experience, all of that. So that like humility, genuinely open, receptive, willing to be vulnerable, willing to be exposed, willing to um, not be special, willing to not have anything to show for yourself, all of those, because it's like the door in initially is maybe disappointment, anxiety, fear, sadness, simplicity. It's like it's really not grand initially, but then as somebody really enters into that, it's like that brings a real level of intimacy and connection. And then in they go to the subtleties and the richness of what's there, as opposed to moving from unconsciously from resistance. And so on the flip side of people who are coming for a peak experience,
Now, these would be the ones who would have
yes. So
profiles who might struggle. Yeah.
yeah, who might struggle. And to say like everyone's going to struggle on some level, but like those who are really wanting to just be in the honesty of what's here, and like honesty is more important than positivity. Like
Mm.
that's a really, and so here was one interesting, there was on that note, there was somebody who came here maybe a couple of years ago, and it was clear to me that she was really struggling in there. And I asked her, like, what would it be like to really welcome what you're feeling and really be with it? And she's like, well, when I discovered spirituality 10 years ago, I was really in a bad way and was having a lot of issues and problems. Then I discovered spirituality, and like it uplifted me, and now I'm really positive. And so I'm afraid that if I really welcome these feelings that are here, it'll bring me back into negativity. And I mean, we just left it at that because she wasn't really willing or wanting to go there, and it's not my role to to be in that with someone, if kind of meet people where they're at. But from where I was sitting, it was like she was negative, like that was what was happening. But because positivity was more important than honesty, it was she was then unwilling to actually be with what was real, and there was almost a hovering above what was really happening because she wanted to be positive. Now we all want to be positive and be in positivity, but I think that's where that like the most important thing, if it's really honesty, then we're going to lean into a potential negativity, anxiety, fear, shame, anger, sadness, because honesty is more important than positivity or some like idealized, romanticized spirituality. And so people who are coming in for a peak experience, who are coming in for um, really anything that's not simple, right? Anything that's just not very simple and accessible right now is going to hit walls of resistance. And and that happens for myself, it happens for everyone in there as they resist what they're feeling and then do things otherwise. For example, there was a woman who came a couple months ago, and she was just I asked her how she was doing, and she said, I'm doing great. There's this contraction in my throat, and I'm just being with it, just open and being with it. But the way that she was talking about it, I could kind of sense that there was something that's funny she was kind of doing that maybe she wasn't aware of, but I could kind of sense it. And so I asked her a few questions like, do you feel like you're managing it and trying to change it, or you're genuinely just like with it and you're fine feeling that way? And she said, well, yeah, I'm trying to change it and relieve it. Like, what's wrong with that? And I was like, well, there's nothing wrong with that at all. My question to you then is, what's more important to you? Like simply being with what's here, or trying to change it into something that you want? Like just simply being honest. And she's like, oh, well, yeah, I didn't. And then so we had this whole exploration of like letting nurture lead, or letting the manager in you, the part that's trying to fix things, lead. And then all of a sudden she had this huge breakthrough where she's like, I'm always trying to fix things. but like it feels good, like this is painful, and so I'm trying to resolve it. But like underneath that is a resistance to what's really there. And so she ended up cracking open where she realized she had spent a whole day and a half in there trying to fix and manage as opposed to just soften and nurture. And so there's an invitation here to like let nurture lead. Like what happens when we let go of spirituality? We're not trying to even achieve spirituality, have a grand experience. You're just taking care of yourself. You're just nurturing what's here. And that tends to bring people more into an intimate, honest connection with what's here when it's just a simple nurturing. And then the next day, she completely dropped into stillness. She's like, I've never experienced like stillness ever, and I'm in it the whole entire day. Once I let go of trying to manage and fix everything, like my whole like surface movement stopped. And now I'm just like rested. And she's like, this is, it completely blew her mind. And she's like, I'm always trying to fix my husband and my friends because I'm always fixing myself. And then, yeah, that just the insight that came from just that simplicity of just being honest. So that was a digression from what leads to more of an unsuccessful experience. And I think for some people, it makes it more challenging. Like there's a lot more veils to kind of have to go through when the reason for coming is a little more complex or it's just not as simple. And then some people really aren't even willing to like to let that go um, because of the devastation of not coming out with anything grand or good to talk about or anything to write home about or anything to show for yourself. It's just like, this is it. I'm just like simply resting in nothing, which one thing leads to another. It's not just that, but there is like an initial letting it all go, which is initially pretty scary.
It's like what I'm hearing here is it's like a looking, even looking for success could be the ingredient for an unsuccessful retreat, right? So
Right,
just,
because then you got to gauge,
yeah,
right? Because then
then
what
you
does
have a
that look
metric.
like?
Yeah,
Yes, the
exactly.
metric. Right. What
So,
does
so I want,
success look like? What's going to happen to you when you've reached success? And this I romanticized idea that like you're going to get to this place and you're never going to experience fear or sadness or anger or shame or any of that. And so the moment you feel it, it's like this can't be it. And then there's the
yeah,
entire movement then is a resistance to not feel that, and you're doing all these things instead of honesty and connection.
yeah,
And that
the total backfiring of actually looking for a spiritual experience instead of going fully into your experience and realizing that's spiritual, not something other than what you're feeling, right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there's that one quote I always share with people while they're in there is the Suzuki Roshi, the most important thing is remembering the most important thing.
Yeah, that's spot on. So because it's so important, I'm gonna ask it one other time. So very specific targeted advice for a long time meditator, right? You've got somebody who's got all the goods. So just because I think this is so key, because in my experience, I noticed these are the people that come in, the white knucklers. I got to get it through. They just rely on the skill set. So very briefly, specific advice for long-term practitioners before going into the dark.
Before, like, as preparation, like
Yeah,
before going in, yeah, as
yeah. Well,
preparation.
and then preparation, and then actually when they're in there, because they're probably closely related, of course.
Right. I mean, I'd say one of the things, and also in hindsight, like, because I had gone in with what I thought was very prepared, is, laying down, whether it's in bed, on the floor, on the earth, on the couch, and like doing nothing, like not having a technique, like just, and whatever that quality is that's most resonant and familiar to somebody of like, however one defines it, opening, welcoming, including, receiving, being with, like whatever it is, but just in the simplicity of doing nothing, not overlaying at all, where you're just genuinely resting and just spending time in that. I think that is one of the greatest preparations for going into the dark. And then maybe, and then from there, noticing impulses of how we move all throughout the day of whatever we're doing and what we're actually like, where that impulse is arising from in us. But in
Beautiful.
terms of like a practice, I think just doing nothing is and even just being in the boredom of it, like what an amazing thing, because that's an expectation, right? Like boredom, when somebody tells me they're bored, it's like, whoa, that's great. Like we've got a really beautiful entry point because there's expectation popping up again that this is too simple and bland. It's not doing anything for me. And so, even being in the boredom is like being bored is a great preparation for that's a really great preparation for going into the dark, is just allowing yourself to be bored and
Yeah,
just being rested with that.
that's fantastic. It's a little bit like a diet. I mean, this whole thing is a sensory stimulation diet. And when you're in there, you're going to be starving. So why not diet a little bit in advance and allow yourself to lose a little bit of unnecessary weight? So a couple of things here. You are truly uniquely situated, Scott. I would be hard pressed. In fact, I can't even think of someone else on the planet, right, that has this situation going and that has guided 350 some people through. So you're uniquely qualified to talk on a number of these topics. What have been some of your biggest surprises? Because there isn't exactly like a program, a degree, even a certification you can get from any institution that says, oh, like psychedelics now, you can become a facilitator, you can become all these things. That's fantastic. And by the way, parenthetically, I find the parallels between psychedelics 50, 60 years ago and Dr. T to be extraordinarily resonant and confluent. But share with us a little bit like the OJT, the on-job training. What have been some of the really surprises for you on this? Because on your end coming in, some of these beginner's mind attitudes can also be very helpful for your level of receptivity and how you can make yourself more available and present for people who are coming in.
So the surprises of witnessing people and what's
Exactly. Like,
unfolded and occurred. Yeah. So I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, exactly.
the Zen mind, beginner's mind completely, I mean, where I'm just like, wow, I never got to have an experience like that. That never happened to me. I probably meditated for years before I got to have a couple minutes of stillness. And here's this person who has never meditated, just got into spirituality 8 months ago, has done a little breath work. And I go up on day two and I'm like, hey, how's it going? And he's just like, nothing is happening, absolutely nothing. And I don't know what's going on. I'm like, how does it feel? He's like, it feels really weird. And it's just like, I'm just like, he's just in stillness for the next 2 days with like things still moving through him, where he's still like having emotions. There's still like connectivity, but his mind is just like crisp and clear and open and empty. And I've seen that so many times. It's completely blown my mind of somebody without practice. Now, whether they're sleeping Buddhas or whatever it is, we're not sure what happens, but where people really enter that. And I think it's different for different people. Like some people I've seen, there was like a really significant moment where they saw what they were doing. They saw how they were trying to replicate, manufacture, have a certain kind of experience, and that was keeping them from being honest with what was really happening. And once they noticed that, they really relaxed as awareness. They weren't so active trying to achieve something, and then their mind quieted and they went into really deep spaces. And they never tried to own it. It wasn't like I meditated and got here or I got this. There was usually a sense of amazement around it. And so that was really humbling and just surprising to witness. Um, I'd say another thing that was really, I'd heard it from lots of spiritual teachers in the past who would kind of just say that women are closer to God. And I just kind of accepted that, never really knew why or what that was meant by, but witnessing people go through the dark, I see that it's the feminine that delivers pretty much everybody to a successful experience, to a really deep, enriching, insightful, warm, nurturing experience. It's all the qualities of the feminine. And since women tend to be more feminine in nature than men, it is amazing the difference in women and men typically who come here. And that the men who really drop in, it's like when they really go into the feminine. And so like the sense of achieving, progressing, power over, um, all of those things kind of fall away. And there's a real like softness, intimacy, delicateness that really drop people in. And that was initially um surprising um, for me. I guess is most spirituality is led by men, right? Well, so many traditions and practices are been created by men, and men tend to, I mean, even leading the fronts on social media and like in the depths of the different spiritual traditions, and then seeing the darkness where like those kind of more linear pointed practices and these things that in some way give a sense of worth and meaning and puff you up were completely irrelevant in the dark, and how women and the feminine were like getting it more and really quickly from just like willing to be honest and sensitive and like really willing to not have to be big and powerful, and just how that was the doorway into freedom for everyone in the dark. And so that was really amazing to witness. And then the men who would come out and just like they could without me even saying anything, they would just like they would know and feel how much in their feminine they were. And they'd be like, wow, like I've never really experienced myself like that or allowed myself to be like that. Like you get no points in the world for being like that. All your points, come from your success and your achievement and all those things, which do nothing for you in the dark. And so those were some of the things that continuously uh, really blow my mind of just witnessing people go through the dark, and ultimately how simple it is. That's been the other thing. Whenever like the simplicity of it is really amazing.
Yeah, the literal disarmament. It's like inner disarmament, right? You can't move, you can't do anything but fundamentally allow yourself to be defeated, as Rilke said, right? Winning does not tempt that man. This is how he grows, by being defeated decisively by constantly greater beings. And here the greater being is the being of darkness itself. And so a little bit about we've hinted a little bit about ways to prep. So I want to go two tracks with you before we start to maybe wrap up for now, because we need to revisit this at a deeper end of the pool later. But two things about ways to prepare. What can someone do if they really want to go? Ways to prepare, and then just as importantly, if not more so, ways to integrate. So
Yeah, so
here again, you have these amazing analogies between set and setting in the psychedelic arena, right? There's so many parallels here. So talk to us about that.
yeah, so on the end of preparation, one thing that's happening right now is Adrian is in the process of building out like an 8 to 10 week prep course. That would be it. That's happening now. So that'll maybe in a couple months from now we'll have that to offer. Um, some people do work with Adrian on Zoom prior to coming as they prepare, but like those things aside, as I shared, one of the preparatory explorations is that, laying down and doing nothing and just like noticing what's happening in one's body. I think somatic work, whether someone gets involved in somatic therapy or just begins to get familiar with somatic work, where they begin to get familiar with what's happening in their body, they begin to get familiar with where honesty is most important, and there's not a goal, there's nothing to achieve. It's just honesty, intimacy, connection. One gets familiar in being exposed and allows themselves to be exposed. And I think that somatic work really, and that like resting and doing nothing really kind of initiates that level of exposure when there is no goal and there's nothing to achieve and you can't gauge how good you're doing it and you don't have a gauge of your worth. So those being some ways to prepare. And then more directly would be the courses once we get that done and maybe somebody working directly with Adrian before they come. I think journaling, like journaling out one really like, and that'll be woven into that course are like journal prompts and like ways of noticing our impulse, like all throughout the day, right before we pick up our phone or we eat or we run or we make a call or before we do anything, checking in with our body of like, what are we moving from? Are we genuinely connected and relaxed, or are we like anxious in some way? And not that and that isn't what matters. It's the connection and the honesty of what's there. So then still go do your thing, even if you're moving from anxiety, but just one beginning to become aware that a lot of their movement is out of anxiety, which would then likely be resistance to something deeper. At least one begins to be honest in that, and that mattering more than being out of anxiety would just be being honest with anxiety. And so those kind of ways of pre-exposing, beginning to get intimate and settled in the body or noticing how we're not, and just laying down and doing nothing in
And so
terms of the prep. Oh yeah.
well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but and so when you're in the dark, this is one thing I wanted to ask earlier that could be reinserted here is in fact the role of this type of work when you're in the dark. You have a yoga mat in there.
Hmm.
When I was up there, I brought my little elastic thing. I spend a good 50 minutes a day in my body doing yoga, doing push-ups, doing sit-ups, doing aerobic stuff, doing the resistance stuff. Because again, I think that's such a central ingredient to prevent the hovering, as you put it, or the potential dangers of dissociation. So, but talk just very briefly along these lines, because I think this is a threefold thing. I think the before, during, and after preparation, experience, integration, they obviously bootstrap each other. They're constantly triangulating and cross-pollinating. So when you're in the retreat, the role of body work, recommendations for doing yoga, or do you just let people do what they want, their own?
Yeah, I mean, we let people do what they want. I mean, we provide, right, there's a foam roller and a yoga mat, so there is that like invitation to that, to like whatever that activity is to bring you into your body. Interesting enough, which is that exploration of the impulse is some people do sit-ups and push-ups and yoga and all that stuff as like an unconscious resistance to distract themselves
Yeah.
from what they're feeling. Like it's almost like it's easier to feel and be in control of what you're feeling as opposed to genuinely just open and honest in the exposure and not being in control of what you're feeling. So some people will go to doing lots of yoga and exercise because they can get in their body and they're in control as opposed to being in your body and just opening and not being in control of what you're feeling. And so, but that invitation of really following the impulse before you engage in whatever you are. But
You know,
yeah, that
another way to say that, I'm going to interrupt you because I think
no,
this
go
is
on.
really important. Another way to language what you're saying when you follow your impulse is to say, almost like a mantra, what's your motivation? Why
Yeah.
are you doing this? If are you doing this as a distractive impulse, or are you in fact doing it because, hey, I just want to stay in my body. I feel like I need to be embodied. And so I think that level of inquiry in and of itself is actually quite compelling.
Totally. And that's where, one of the things we suggest is like let nurture lead. When people are like, I don't know what to do, and it's like let nurture lead. What would it look like for you to receive care? And like in that, it's like you're in your body and you're feeling and you're not really controlling. If you're bringing anything, you're just bringing warmth to what's already here. And so, yeah, there is that invitation to get in the bath, to do yoga, to move your body, to be embodied. Um, while one's in there.
Wonderful.
So yeah, and I think we touched on a bit of like kind of the explorations and some of the prompts that we have while people are in there to explore. And then on the flip side, in terms of integration,
Let me ask one question before I go to integration.
yeah, sure.
I find it very interesting, and thank you for letting me interrupt you,
Yeah.
is you didn't overtly mention the word meditation. I mean, you're
Mm.
talking about wonderful somatic work, which you could obviously you could dovetail meditation, but I find it quite compelling that you haven't said something like, "Well, I think people should meditate more before."
I guess I feel like that word, it's it's almost like it has like a time and a place, meditation.
Hmm.
Right. And so, like, maybe when people envision like they're sitting upright and they're sitting in this location where they tend to meditate, and it has a beginning and an end. And I think anything that has a very clear beginning and an end, um, when one's using it as the preparation for the dark, which really doesn't have a beginning and an end, it tends to, I think it has some benefit, but I don't know how much it, it genuinely allows people to settle into what's just naturally arising. I mean, I think meditation in its essence, yes, of course, is like the greatest preparation, but I think it means so much. It means so many different things to so many different people. Like it could be a way of focusing your attention and controlling what's happening, a way of like breathing and moving energy. And so, but the meditation of open awareness, of just genuinely being honest and connected with what's here, would ultimately be a best practice. But since there are so many different forms of meditation, um, I think the most open-ended um, really lends itself well to the darkness.
Okay, so integration.
Integration. So one thing that we've been doing that you kind of really helped kick off is we're doing these Zoom group integration calls, and we're doing them once a month with all the past dark retreatants. Adrian's leaned in, and so it'll be in that somatic orientation that we kind of prepare people in the before and the during and the after in the session that they have with her. So we carry that vein forward. And so that's one thing that we've really established, and perhaps we'll begin to put more energy into that of how do we really like we come to know something so profoundly new and different in there, and then we go back to our world and all our conditioning and our habits and everyone that reflects back all our old ways of being, like how to live honestly to what we most deeply know. Like we came to know something in our being, a new way of moving, and how to be in that, in the aftermath after the darkness. And so the integration calls that we're beginning to do is one way. I mean, another thing that I really encourage people, and I love to do myself, is just get back into the dark a little. And like that could just be, since we have a bathtub, and that tends to be one of people's favorite places in the dark, get into the bathtub, and making someone's bathroom dark tends to be, fairly easy enough. Or just go in at night and turn out the lights, and maybe you just need to put a towel under your door and just like go into the dark in your bathroom and get into the bathtub and just spend an hour or two just relaxing, doing nothing, and just like attuning to the body and just being with what's here. And so that, being another way to integrate and get back into the darkness.
Yeah, that's really great. And I think one of the playful things I riff on a little bit here is again using the analogy of plant medicine psychedelics and the notion of microdosing. Well, you can microdose literally in the blink of an eye, right? I mean, every time you close your eyes, you can touch into that spirit of interiority and really work with recapturing that wonderful space.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so anything along these lines as we start to close up for today, because what I'm seeing here, this is a marvelous introduction to this amazing practice. And then I definitely see a part two where we can venture into the deep end of the pool. Let's go and talk a little bit deeper about fear, its relationship to ego dissolution, its relationship to death. Because I think on one level, people are anxious of the dark because it is a suggestion of the death space. But that death space can also, you can't have death without birth. And so there's so many deep ends we could explore maybe for round two. But for round one, in terms of like anything I didn't ask you, anything you'd like to share about the majesty of this practice, what you've learned, your aspirations, or anything that might come to mind that we haven't pinged on.
Yeah. I just for me it's like it's been a constant uncovering. Like, and there is, one of the other, I guess this ties in to one of the questions you asked earlier of the qualities that allow somebody to have a successful experience. And one is like kind of being willing to to let what you go know, like being willing to be wrong, or something like in that beginner's mind, like there's that openness, like we're within myself, there's like a constant uncovering and seeing things that I didn't see, and just being willing to be in the exposure where when I can make honesty more important than being right or being in a certain way, and seeing how that, while we're with people in the dark, is that thing that brings people into the freedom and the richness and the depths in there, that constant uncovering. And so we're the offering here, and what we're in with people is constantly evolving. Like we don't have it figured out, like it's this like ever evolving, ever refining exploration, and in that, like if you asked me a couple months ago, do people experience fear in the dark? I would have said not many, but something new that Adrian pointed out, and then I could begin to see, is the level of fear that almost everyone is in the dark. And that fear could be as small as just feeling unsettled in one's body, which like it's maybe not a huge fear, but there is some level of overwhelm and fear. And then once we began to notice that, the way that we were with people, especially in the beginning, really changed, because somebody could spend their entire time in the dark managing their experience because they're in fear and they're unsettled. And so, and then for me, that's really uncovered different layers for me to see the ways that I manage my experience and cover when I feel unsettled. And then being in that invitation of like, what would it be like to just be honest with the fact that I'm not feeling comfortable, as opposed to very easily doing something to make myself comfortable, but it's not actually resolving the underlying thing that's going on.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, that invitation to really be in uh, the discomfort without controlling it, right? Different than being in a cold plunge, like you can get out of the water, like there's some level of control, but being in feelings that yeah, are deep in the interior, that like the way through is really being with.
that's really great. You mentioned Trungpa earlier. He has this incredible line here that I just really is applicable. He said, there is no way out. The magic is to discover that there is a way in."
Mm.
And can you imagine anything more in than the invitation, pun intended, of working at such deep levels? This is what we started out an hour and a half on, talking about this deep level of inner work. I don't think there's anything as inner as what you can experience when you're actually forced inside, which is really where evolution takes place these days.
Yeah.
So just before we close up, aspirations, you have 3 units now. Talk to us a little bit about your aspirations for expansion, because there's such a demand, and there's going to be greater demand as we continue to work together. Scott and I are doing some really cool things to expand the studies behind this, everything. It's just really taking off. So share a little bit about visions, aspirations, dreams for what you see both within your own orbit and worldwide.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a movement we have the neighboring land, we have permits to expand, to build 7 more caves, to build a lodge. And so we're kind of right now in that exploration of the expansion to add on. And also exploring where is that sweet spot, as it's a lot more what we've experienced is it's a lot more than just putting somebody in a dark room. Like there is the experienced support and how the container's held tends to be uh, adds a lot to the kind of experience people have. So growing at a level where we still maintain the level of intimacy with each person who is here. So yeah, there is a movement to expand. I'd love to um, we're going to dive into some research, which is really exciting. And in that expansion, also like having a hub of like where there is different collaborations, explorations, like dark retreats are growing worldwide, and there's dark retreats popping up. I mean, there's been a bunch that I just recently discovered that have popped up in Europe, and there's in South Africa and in Australia, in Costa Rica, in other parts of the States. And so, how to one thing would be having a hub where people in the similar vein in that web can share, can explore, and can kind of really birth this thing, this darkness retreat, darkness therapy that is emerging here.
That's beautiful, Scott. Definitely have to do it again.
Yeah.
So much more to talk about, but a really wonderful initial foray into the most impactful practice I've ever done in my life. And so to get to know you in this journey has been a delight. You're a beautiful human being. What you're offering, the goodness, integrity, centeredness that's embodied in your very presence goes a long way to the success of what you're doing up there. And I really want to celebrate that and support it. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you probably have to go back up and feed the retreatants or check in with them, but let's circle back around. Let's do this again. Go to the deeper end of the pool, and I think we can explore then the extraordinary scope, profundity, multivalence of this practice, just how far and how deep you can take this. But today was a wonderful introduction to this practice, and thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it, Scott.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Andrew.
See you soon.
Bye.